She doesn't text first very often. She doesn't shower you with attention. She doesn't go out of her way to make her feelings obvious. In fact, if someone asked you to describe her behavior, you might say she seems a little distant, a little reserved, maybe even a little cold. And because of that, you've probably convinced yourself that there isn't much going on beneath the surface. Most men would reach exactly the same conclusion. They assume that attraction should be easy to spot. If a woman likes you, she should make it clear. If she's interested, she should find reasons to be around you. If she's thinking about you, surely there would be some obvious sign. But what if that's exactly where so many men get it wrong? The truth is that people do not always behave the way we expect when emotions become involved. Sometimes they move closer, sometimes they pull away, sometimes they become more expressive, sometimes they become surprisingly quiet. The mistake many men make is assuming that distance always means disinterest. They see a woman become more reserved and immediately decide she has lost interest. They stop reaching out. They stop paying attention. They convince themselves that the opportunity is gone. What they don't realize is that some women become more cautious precisely because they care more than they want to admit. Think about how vulnerable attraction can make a person feel. The more someone matters, the more there is to lose. A woman who feels nothing can be relaxed. She can say whatever comes to mind because the outcome doesn't matter very much. But a woman who genuinely likes someone often becomes far more aware of every interaction. She starts wondering how she is being perceived. She starts thinking about whether she is revealing too much. She starts paying attention to details that never seemed important before. Ironically, those feelings can make her appear less interested on the outside, while her mind is becoming more occupied on the inside. This is why some of the most important signals are also the easiest to miss. They don't look dramatic. They don't announce themselves. They appear in small moments that most people overlook. A quick glance that disappears the second you notice it. A detail she remembers weeks later. A sudden message that arrives for no obvious reason. Individually, these things don't seem significant. Together, they begin telling a completely different story. A story that many men never see because they are too busy looking for obvious signs while ignoring the subtle ones. And here's where things become really interesting. There is one particular behavior that shows up again and again when a woman is thinking about a man more than she lets on. Most men notice it but completely misunderstand what they're seeing. They interpret it as indifference when in reality it can sometimes mean the exact opposite. Understanding this changes the way you look at attraction because it forces you to stop focusing only on what people say and start paying attention to what they consistently do. Before we get into the first sign, I want you to think about someone who has left you confused, someone whose actions never seem to match the story you were telling yourself. Because as we go through these patterns, you may start noticing things you missed before. You may begin connecting dots that never seemed related at the time. And if that happens, you'll realize that attraction is often much quieter, much more complicated, and much more revealing than most people ever imagine. The first sign is something that happens long before she says a single word. It starts with where her attention goes when she thinks nobody is paying attention. The first sign is that she watches you when she thinks you aren't looking. Most men completely misunderstand this because they assume attraction always announces itself in obvious ways. They imagine that if a woman likes them, she will constantly try to get their attention. She'll find reasons to start conversations. She'll make her feelings easier to read. But attention often works differently than that. When someone becomes emotionally interesting to us, our curiosity tends to increase before our confidence does. We want to know more about them. We pay attention to them. We observe them. Yet at the same time, we don't necessarily want them to know we're doing it. Imagine being at a birthday party, a work gathering, or even a casual dinner with mutual friends. You look across the room and notice her looking in your direction. The moment your eyes meet, she immediately looks away. Most men dismiss this. They assume it means nothing. They tell themselves she was probably looking at someone behind them or simply staring into space. Once or twice, maybe that's true. But when it becomes a pattern, something else is often happening. People naturally monitor what interests them. They pay attention to what captures their thoughts. And when a woman is quietly thinking about you more than she admits, her attention tends to drift in your direction, even when she isn't consciously planning it. What's interesting is that this behavior doesn't only happen in person anymore. It appears online too. She views your stories unusually quickly. She seems to know what you've been doing even though you haven't spoken recently. She reacts to something you posted that most people would have ignored. Sometimes she'll accidentally reveal that she's paying closer attention than she intended, not because she's trying to investigate your life, but because her curiosity keeps pulling her back. Her mind wants information, it wants updates, it wants small pieces of your world. The reason this matters is because attention is one of the clearest indicators of emotional investment. People can fake words, they can hide feelings, they can pretend not to care. What is much harder to control is where their attention naturally goes when nobody is watching. A woman who feels completely indifferent usually isn't spending her energy observing you. She's focused on her own life, her own concerns, her own priorities. But when someone repeatedly finds herself paying attention to you, even in subtle ways, it often reveals an emotional interest she hasn't fully expressed. Now, this doesn't mean every glance automatically signals attraction. That's where many men get themselves into trouble. The goal is not to convince yourself that every woman who looks your way is secretly obsessed. The goal is to notice patterns. One glance means very little. Consistent attention means much more. Attraction rarely reveals itself through a single moment. It reveals itself through repeated behaviors that keep showing up over time. And that leads us directly into the second sign. Because attention by itself is only the beginning. Watching someone is one thing. Remembering them is another. And when a woman starts remembering small details that most people would have forgotten days ago, that's usually when you realize she has been carrying pieces of your conversations around in her mind far longer than you ever expected. The second sign is that she remembers details that most people would have forgotten a long time ago. This is where the pattern starts becoming much harder to ignore because attention and memory are closely connected. People remember what matters to them. Clears throat, not perfectly, not every single detail. But the human brain naturally places extra importance on people who occupy our thoughts. That's why a woman who seems completely casual on the surface can sometimes surprise you with something she remembers weeks later. You might mention that you had an important presentation coming up at work. You don't think much of it afterward. Then, 2 weeks later, she casually asks how it went. You mention a restaurant you wanted to try, and a month later, she brings it up as if the conversation happened yesterday. You tell a story about your younger brother, and somehow she remembers his name even though you only mentioned it once. Most men underestimate how significant this can be because they assume she simply has a good memory. Sometimes she does, but there is a difference between someone who remembers information and someone who remembers you. When a woman is thinking about you regularly, your conversations don't disappear the moment they end. They linger. She replays them. She reflects on them. She fills in details. The things you say become attached to a person she finds emotionally interesting, which makes those details much easier for her brain to hold on to. Think about your own life for a moment. There are probably dozens of conversations you've had during the past month that you barely remember. Names fade, stories disappear, small details get lost. That's normal. The brain filters information constantly. But when someone becomes important to us, that filter changes. Suddenly, details stick. A comment that seemed insignificant becomes memorable. A passing story becomes meaningful. A random fact becomes something worth holding on to. The same thing often happens when a woman develops a deeper interest in someone. What's fascinating is that she may not even realize she's doing it. Nobody sits down and consciously decides to memorize details about another person. The process happens automatically. Her attention gives the information value and her brain quietly stores it away. Then weeks later, she mentions something you completely forgot you ever told her. That's usually when men begin realizing they may have underestimated how much mental space they're occupying. This becomes even more noticeable when she remembers details that offer her no practical benefit. Remembering your favorite sports team is one thing. Remembering a story about a vacation you took 6 months ago is something else entirely. Remembering the name of your dog, the city you grew up in, or the hobby you mentioned once during a casual conversation often signals a level of attention that goes beyond simple politeness. Most people don't retain information that carefully unless the person connected to it matters to them. And this is where the pattern starts becoming difficult to dismiss. First, her attention keeps drifting toward you. Now, she is remembering things that most people would have forgotten. The pieces are beginning to fit together, but the next sign might be even more revealing because it doesn't involve her at all. It involves the people closest to her. And when her friends start behaving differently around you, that's often when you realize your name has been appearing in conversations long before you ever knew it. The third sign is that her friends seem to know far more about you than they should. This is one of the most reliable signs because it often reveals what is happening behind the scenes when you are not around. A woman can hide her feelings from you. She can act casual. She can pretend she doesn't care. She can convince herself that she isn't going to make her interest obvious. What becomes much harder to control is what happens when she is talking to the people she trusts most. Human beings process their emotions through conversation. They talk through confusion. They talk through excitement. They talk through attraction. And when a woman starts thinking about a man frequently, there is a good chance her closest friends hear about him long before he realizes it. You might notice this during a group gathering. You walk into a room and one of her friends immediately recognizes you, even though you've never officially met. Maybe they exchange a quick glance with her. Maybe they smile a little differently when you approach. Maybe someone makes a comment that feels strangely familiar, as though they've already heard parts of your story before. At first, you might dismiss it. You tell yourself you're imagining things, but over time, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Her friends seem unusually aware of who you are. This happens because attraction creates conversation. Imagine a woman lying in bed at night, replaying an interaction she had with you earlier that day. Maybe she wonders why a certain comment stayed in her mind. Maybe she's trying to figure out whether you're interested. Maybe she's confused by her own feelings. What does she do? The same thing most people do. She talks about it with someone she trusts, a best friend, a sister, someone whose opinion matters to her. She shares details. She describes conversations. She asks questions. Before long, the people closest to her know your name, know pieces of your story, and know far more about the situation than you realize. What's particularly revealing is when her friends accidentally expose that knowledge. A friend might say, "Oh, you're the one she's always talking about," and immediately try to change the subject. Someone might tease her when you walk into the room. Another friend might suddenly become interested in meeting you after hearing about you for weeks. These moments often seem small, but they reveal something important. You have become a recurring topic in conversations that happen when you are not present. Now, this doesn't mean every friend interaction automatically signals attraction. Friends can know about you for many reasons. The key is context. If her friends consistently seem aware of who you are, if they react differently when you're around, or if they appear to be observing the interaction between the two of you, there is often a reason for that. People don't usually spend large amounts of time discussing someone who has no emotional significance. And this brings us to the sign that confuses men more than any other. In fact, many men see it as proof that a woman is losing interest when it can sometimes mean the exact opposite. This is the sign that causes countless men to walk away too early. They assume the connection is fading when in reality, her feelings may be growing stronger than ever. The fourth sign begins when she suddenly reaches out to you for no obvious reason, only to disappear again shortly afterward. The fourth sign is that she reaches out to you out of nowhere, creates a great interaction, and then disappears again. This is probably the sign that confuses men more than any other because it seems to make absolutely no sense. One day, your phone lights up with a message from her. It might be a funny meme, it might be a random question, it might be something that instantly reminds you of a conversation you had weeks ago. Whatever it is, she initiated it. The conversation flows naturally. There is laughter, there is energy, there is connection. For a moment, everything feels easy. You start thinking that maybe things are finally moving forward. Then she vanishes. Hours turn into days. Sometimes days turn into a week. The same woman who seemed excited to talk suddenly becomes quiet again. Naturally, most men assume they did something wrong. They replay the conversation in their head. They examine every message. They wonder whether they said too much or not enough. They convince themselves that her silence must mean she lost interest. But what if that's not what is happening at all? What many men fail to understand is that attraction can create internal conflict. A woman who feels nothing has very little to think about. A woman who feels a strong emotional pull often has much more to process. She starts wondering where things are heading. She starts questioning her own feelings. She starts thinking about possibilities that didn't exist before. And for some women, that creates a strange cycle. They move closer because they want connection, then pull back because the connection suddenly feels real. Imagine a woman who has been thinking about you throughout the week. She sees something funny and immediately thinks of you. She hears a song that reminds her of a conversation you had. She remembers something you said. Eventually, curiosity wins. She reaches out. The conversation happens. She enjoys it. But now, the emotional reality of the connection becomes stronger than it was before. Instead of feeling relieved, she becomes more aware of her own vulnerability. That's when some women instinctively create distance again. This is why the pattern matters more than the silence itself. A woman who repeatedly disappears and reappears is very different from a woman who simply disappears. One pattern suggests inconsistency. The other suggests ongoing emotional investment. If she keeps finding reasons to reconnect, if she keeps reappearing after periods of distance, there is usually a reason for that. People rarely continue reopening doors that hold no value to them. Now, this doesn't mean every disappearing act should be romanticized. Some people are genuinely busy. Some people are inconsistent communicators. Some people simply enjoy attention. That's why no single sign should ever be viewed in isolation. The power comes from looking at the bigger picture. Is she watching you? Is she remembering details? Do her friends seem unusually aware of who you are? Does she repeatedly find reasons to reconnect? When several of these patterns start appearing together, the story becomes much clearer. And that leads us directly into the fifth sign. Because while messages and attention happen consciously, the next signal often happens without a woman realizing it at all. In fact, it's one of the hardest things for a person to fake. The fifth sign appears when her entire behavior changes around you in ways that don't happen around anybody else. The fifth sign is that she behaves differently around you than she does around everyone else. This is one of those signs that people often overlook because they are looking for words instead of behavior. They want a clear confession. They want an obvious signal. They want certainty. What they fail to notice is that emotions often reveal themselves through changes in behavior long before they reveal themselves through direct communication. When someone has no emotional investment in you, they tend to act the same way around you that they act around everyone else. There is consistency, there is predictability, there is very little emotional reaction. But when someone starts caring, that consistency often begins to change. You might notice that she becomes quieter when you're around. This confuses many men because they assume attraction should make a woman more expressive, not less. But emotions don't always work that way. Sometimes a woman who is naturally outgoing suddenly becomes more reserved around the one person whose opinion matters to her. She starts thinking more carefully about what she says. She becomes more aware of how she is being perceived. The same woman who can talk effortlessly with everyone else suddenly seems slightly nervous when the conversation involves you. For other women, the opposite happens. Instead of becoming quiet, they become unusually energetic. They laugh harder at your jokes. They become more playful. They seem more engaged than normal. The important thing is not the specific behavior itself. The important thing is the difference. Something changes. The version of her that shows up around you is not quite the same version that everyone else experiences. That's often because your presence creates an emotional reaction that other people simply don't create. This becomes especially noticeable in group settings. Watch how she interacts with other people, then compare it to how she interacts with you. Maybe she maintains eye contact a little longer. Maybe she remembers things you say while forgetting details from everyone else. Maybe she seems more self-conscious. Maybe she adjusts her appearance when she knows you'll be around. These behaviors are often subtle enough that she may not even realize she's doing them. That's what makes them so revealing. They are emotional reactions, not carefully planned strategies. One reason this sign is so powerful is because people can control their words much more easily than they can control their instincts. A woman can tell herself not to make her feelings obvious. She can decide not to send a message. She can choose not to initiate a conversation, but controlling every small behavioral change is much harder. That's why attraction often leaks out through body language, tone of voice, nervous habits, and shifts in energy long before it appears anywhere else. Now, it's important to remember that nervousness alone doesn't automatically equal attraction. Some people become anxious for many different reasons. That's why, once again, you should look for patterns rather than isolated moments. If she's paying attention to you, remembering details, talking about you with friends, reaching out unexpectedly, and behaving differently around you than she does around other people, those pieces begin forming a much larger picture. A picture that becomes even clearer when we get to the next sign. Because the sixth sign is one that most men completely misunderstand. In fact, many men see it as a problem when it can actually be a sign that she is taking you far more seriously than you realize. It shows up when she starts testing you, not because she wants to push you away, but because she's trying to figure out whether you're truly the person she hopes you are. The sixth sign is that she tests you. Most men hear the word test and immediately think of games, manipulation, or unnecessary drama. That's why they completely misunderstand what is happening. They assume a woman is trying to make their life difficult, when in reality, she is often trying to answer a question she hasn't been able to answer yet. The question isn't whether you like her. Most of the time, she already has a pretty good idea about that. The real question is whether you are the same person under pressure that you appear to be when everything is easy. Think about it from her perspective. If she has been paying attention to you, remembering details about you, talking about you with friends, and thinking about you more than she admits, then the stakes have become higher. She is no longer evaluating a stranger. She is evaluating someone who could potentially matter to her. And when people start caring, they naturally become more cautious. They want reassurance that their feelings are being invested in the right person. This is why she might occasionally say something designed to measure your reaction. Maybe she mentions another guy and watches your response. Maybe she disagrees with you on a small issue. Maybe she takes longer than usual to reply to a message. Maybe she changes plans and pays attention to how you handle it. These moments often seem insignificant, but they give her information. She's observing whether you become angry, insecure, controlling, needy, or emotionally reactive. She's trying to see whether the confident man she likes is actually confident when things don't go perfectly. The mistake many men make is treating every small challenge like a threat. A woman cancels one plan and they immediately become cold. She mentions another man and they become jealous. She takes a little longer to respond and they start demanding explanations. Without realizing it, they reveal exactly the behaviors she was worried about in the first place. Instead of demonstrating confidence, they demonstrate how fragile that confidence really is. What makes this sign so important is that it often appears when a woman is becoming more emotionally invested, not less. If she truly didn't care, there would be very little reason to evaluate you. She would simply move on with her life. The fact that she is paying attention to your reactions often means your role in her mind has become more significant. She wants to know whether you can handle uncertainty. She wants to know whether you remain steady when things don't go according to plan. She wants to know whether your actions match the image she has been building in her head. That doesn't mean you should overanalyze every interaction or convince yourself that every challenge is a hidden sign of attraction. The key is consistency. When a woman repeatedly invests attention, remembers details, involves her friends, reaches out unexpectedly, behaves differently around you, and then pays close attention to your reactions, a pattern begins to emerge. The individual signs become less important than the overall picture they create together. And that brings us to the final sign. In many ways, it's the most important one because it ties everything else together. It's the sign that reveals whether her interest is simply curiosity or whether you have become someone she genuinely thinks about long after the conversation ends. Once you understand this final pattern, you'll start seeing attraction very differently because it often appears in the smallest moments that most people completely overlook. The final sign is that she keeps finding reasons to bring herself back into your world. At first, this might not seem very significant. In fact, it can be so subtle that most men overlook it completely. They are looking for, gee,